Black Myth Wukong just dropped a benchmarking tool so that we can see how well this game is going to perform on our devices. So I'm actually really curious to see, is this game going to play on the Steam Deck? So you know the drill. I'm going to go through all the settings, low, medium, high, very high, and we'll just see how much we can push the Steam Deck. Without any further delay, let's get into it. All right, we're going to stay at native 800p and turn off motion blur. Super resolution set to 90 FSR, frame generation is on, and we're gonna start things off as easy as possible, low settings. Right off the gates, we're getting over 40 frames per second, and the vibrancy of the OLED screen is incredible. This game is looking awesome on the Steam Deck. Not dipping below 40 frames per second, and it's running pretty smooth. It looks great. This is good to see that we're going to be able to play this new title on the Steam Deck. Even with its dated, slower hardware, the Steam Deck just continuously proves its value in how well optimized it is. It's like so close to wanting to be able to just get locked in at 45 frames per second, which would be incredible to be able to play this brand new Unreal Engine 5 AAA title on the Steam Deck at 45 frames per second. Mind you, this is the benchmarking tool, so this is probably best case scenario. It just jumped all the way up to 50 frames per second for a second there. This benchmarking tool just makes me want to know so bad how well the game is actually going to play, because this can't be a true gameplay experience. I just have a hard time believing that we're going to experience over 40 frames per second on this brand new title like this. There's no fighting in this. There's like maybe one or two characters max on screen during this whole thing. So it leaves me wondering, like, what is real life gonna be like? But as a first pass at low settings, that's very promising. Getting an average of 44 frames per second, amazing. If we lock that in at 45, I wonder how much it would help with the lows that were 37 frames per second. All right, from low, everything set to medium, 800p, medium settings, right there at the mid 30 frames per second on this intro, but we seem to always dip in frame rate as we pass through this bridge. So I'm curious to see if this is gonna stay above 30 frames per second. And it's actually doing the opposite. Now it's jumping to 38, 37. All right, there we go. Now down to 33 frames per second, but keeping it above 30 frames per second so far, which is great to see, but also it doesn't look like we're gonna get much further than medium settings. But if you wanted a little bit better quality, you could lock your frame rate in at 30 frames per second and play this at medium quality. The other thing is obviously bumping a few of the things down to low and keeping some things at high and medium, and then you'd probably have the sweet spot for the best looking 30 frames per second gameplay. To be honest, I'm not mad at all. If the game is going to play like this in real life next week, I'm happy. The fact that we could actually play a brand new AAA title in Unreal Engine 5 that looks like this on the Steam Deck native with, you know, just flipping on FSR and frame gen, and it can play like this is very promising for the future of handheld devices. Even something like the Steam Deck, which is notoriously underpowered now compared to the other options out there. I have a video where I did this exact same test with the Ally, and it definitely performed better, which is what I was anticipating. It's just a lot better at handling the frame generation because its processor was created for that. But it really looks like we won't get much past medium. I'd be surprised if high is even gonna get us a 30 frames per second. We got an average of 34 with some lows of 27. So we're already dipping below the 30 frames per second, but I'd say 27 is fine. And if we locked in the device at 30 frames per second, I'm sure that would help it out quite a bit. All right, we're gonna get a little bit crazy here. High settings. Let's see what this baby can do. high settings, 800p, and as I assumed, we are not getting a 30 frames per second. It's very close. It's in the high 20s, but I don't think anybody's going to want to play this game not at least at 30 frames per second. And again, like I was saying earlier, there's definitely some wiggle room to bump some of the settings to high and some things to medium low and get a beautiful locked in 30 frames per second experience. But yeah, the Steam Deck is not handling high settings, and they still have very high and cinematic. So we're definitely not going to be playing at those settings. With the water, a couple characters on screen, we're dipping to the lower 20 frames per second. I'm really impressed with how well optimized this game is. Again, this is their benchmark tool, so I don't know if I can even say that I'm so surprised of how well optimized their game is, because is this the game? I mean, I understand that they pulled from what they created in the game and made the benchmarking tool, but releasing it before the game comes out is cool, as long as it's nothing like, you know, sleight of hand tricking us here. Like, if this is a real and a very solid benchmarking tool that's giving us an incredibly realistic viewpoint, then I'm pumped. Like, I wasn't expecting to play at high settings. I honestly wasn't even expecting that the game would run at medium settings. So if it does, then this is great news. So yeah, high settings, 26 frames per second with lows of 21. So we're probably not going to be playing this game at high settings on the Steam Deck. What we can do is bump down the resolution to like 50% and try to run this again and see if it looks acceptable and can play. So the only thing I'm going to change is the super resolution from 90% to around 50, which is going to be rough. So that's a major decrease, and potentially it's just going to look so bad that we would never do this. But for science, let's do it. 50% resolution at high settings. It's definitely helping us get above that 30 frames per second. And honestly, it doesn't look as horrible as I was expecting it to look, jumping all the way to 50%. I'm pretty impressed with the ability for FSR at such a low resolution set upscaling to look this good. So maybe I take back what I said. If you really want to play at high settings, maybe it is possible to lock it in at 30 frames per second. Just put that resolution scale down to 50 and just rock it all day long. The FSR being set to 50% and then it's doing its thing in the background, pretty impressive. The fact that we were able to do that and turn high settings from unplayable to playable might be worth it. I don't know if I would play this way. I kind of liked the almost 45 frames per second just at low settings. And then if I wanted to jump in and experience the amazing quality of this game, I'd probably just jump on like GeForce Now, crank everything to max settings, and really experience the quality. There we go. 34 frames per second with lows of 28. So now, dumping it down to 50% at high settings gave us very similar performance to the medium settings that we were just doing, and not as horrible looking as I was anticipating. Very impressive. All right, just for fun, at 50% super resolution FSR frame gen on, we're gonna go to very high settings, and I'm gonna lock this in at 30, and I'm gonna do the frame limit to 30 frames per second. All right, very high settings, 50% resolution, FSR and frame gen, everything we can throw at this thing. And yeah, we are not going to be playing this at very high settings. I'm actually surprised how much of a hit it took from high to very high, because high was running at above 30 frames per second and the lows were just barely under 30, and now we're in the mid-teens. So this is definitely not going to be a playable situation. Okay, so that is as far as we can push it, but now I want to try to see if we could lock in a 45 frames per second medium settings. So I'm going to bring up super resolution, set to 75 FSR frame generation, and then we will go to medium settings, and then I'm going to change frame limit to 45. All right, little Steam Deck, let's get a solid 45 frames per second, please. But it doesn't look like it is. We're hanging at the 40 frames per second. All right, let's just go to low settings. Medium settings, locking it at 45 frames per second was a little bit of wishful thinking. Super resolution, 75 FSR, frame generation on, low settings with frame limit to 45 hertz. Can we get this game to give us a 45 lock gameplay? Let's find out. Starting off really strong with a solid 45 frames per second. Steam Deck is saying 45, their benchmark was saying 44. It's kind of dipping from 43 to 45 frames per second right there. And now we're going to start entering the territory where it gets a little harder to run. Honestly, this is not looking bad at all. Locking in at 45, maybe every once in a while when it gets a little graphically intense, it'll dip 1 or 2 frames, but that's not that big of a deal. Again, if this game can play like this when it comes out next week on the Steam Deck, nobody can complain about that. This is incredible. This all just makes me wonder what the heck we're gonna get with the Steam Deck version 2. Like 60 frames per second on these same settings right here in this game? That would be awesome. But yeah, honestly, this I'd tweak a little bit more, but this is probably close to the settings that I'm gonna try playing this game at and enjoying it on the Steam Deck. This is doing a great job staying very consistent on that 45 frames per second. I'll be interested to see what the benchmark said the lowest frames were, because it doesn't seem like it's going, maybe it hit 43 a few times, but for the most part, we're right there at 45 frames per second. I might have spoke too soon. Did it just go to 42? We're gonna find out. I think for sure there's gonna be a 45 frames per second low, and then a medium, maybe a few things high and low, like custom set that's at 30 frames per second on the Steam Deck. But having those two options is great. There we go. An average of 44 frames per second. Apparently we had a minimum go to 40. But dude, 40 frames per second with a solid 44, 45 frames per second? That's phenomenal. We recently passed over 5,000 subscribers. Thank you all so much. Make sure to leave a comment, hit that thumbs up, and let me know any other games you'd like me to test out on the Steam Deck or the ROG Ally for now, and I will see you in the next one.